component lifecycle hooks is nothing but generally component lifecycle hooks. Every component from start to end, it will undergo several phases. That means from the initialization, that means initialization of component, from initialization of the component, you can say that creating of component. From creating of component up to the destroying of component. Between these two stages, between these two, so many phases will be there. So we generally call as component life cycle. That means actually life cycle indicates various phases that a component have to follow from start to end. So that means one simple example means concept I will show you here. So in this, our application is having, so we have an Angular application. So we have an Angular application. And this Angular application is configured with several components. So in the index page, we have a index.html, that is the startup page. And it have a lot of components. Suppose we have a login component. So login component. We have like some register component. Some components are there. Usually what happens is when client requests any component, that means, so the client requests any component. So that means we are accessing this application. So here, HTTP localhost and our application running here. I access some login component. Later in the next level, we will discuss how to create the routes so that you can navigate from one location to another. Navigation, we will see that. When I requested login component, now what should happen here is, so when you request that, first application must load this component into memory. That means we have the application memory. Now into the application memory, you have ng modules. ng modules. This ng modules will pick up your component, because components can be configured and initialized through these ng modules. And what ng modules will do, it will load this component into memory. When component is requested, first step is the component related library is loaded into memory. The component related library is loaded into memory. After the library loaded into memory, so then the component is created. The component is created and it is rendered to you. It is created and rendered to you. That means the basic order is nothing but generally. So means how the approach usually works is, first step. So ng modules, what it will do is loads the library required, loads the library required for component, What's the library required for the component? It is going to load the library required for the component. ng modules is going to do that. ng modules is going to load the library required for the component. It loads the library required for the component. And after loading the library required for component, next step, what it will do is, so it creates a component, creates the component. So that means a component instance is created, component object actually. It creates the component object. After creating the component object, this component is rendered into the page. This component is rendered into the page. That means component rendered. Rendered means generated output. The component is rendered. After rendering, so if you close or you finish using the component and you request another component, so that means if you request any another component, this current component will be destroyed. So destroyed. The current component will be destroyed. That means the memory allocated for the component will be destroyed. That means it will actually clean up the memory. So clean up memory allocated for the component. That means component from creation to destroying, between creation and destroying, so many phases will happen again. So many phases will happen. That means the component created and to component destroyed. Inside that, internally, a component undergoes several phases. It will undergo several phases. And these phases are maintained by a set of events. These are maintained by a set of events. That means actually 3 steps are there. That means component creates, component updates, and the component destroys. Destroys the creates, updates, and destroys. And in that, several phases will happen. So many events will be there. From begin to end, so many phases will be there. These phases, people call them as generally life cycle methods. These phases are controlled by some methods. We call them as life cycle methods, or people call it as life cycle hooks. Why they are called hooks? Because they have a sequential order, one after another. One hook will pick another hook. So that means it hooks a particular method and pulls it. After that, it hooks another method and pulls it. After that, another method hooks and pulls it. That means there is an order for hooking and accessing the methods. That's why we call generally as life cycle hooks. Actually, these are all life cycle methods. Means in general terminology, they are life cycle methods. That means every component comprises of several methods. Actually, so that means more, now we will go more technically internally. See, when we generally create a component, so configure a component, so export, or you say simply, export class login component. Login component. Now, I hope you all people can tell. So in this component, what is the first method to execute? We don't have any methods, but I think you can tell what is the first method to execute in this component. I think you can tell that. So what is the first component? What is the first method to execute in this component? Observe carefully. That component is a class. That component is a class. Observe carefully. That component is a class. What is the first method to execute? Yes, now you understood, right? So that means the constructor. That means the first method to execute. The first method to execute obviously will be a constructor. That means what is the purpose of constructor? What is the purpose of constructor? What is the purpose of constructor? Technically, we discussed in the TypeScript concept. We discussed a TypeScript concept, right? So in the TypeScript concept we discussed, I told you detailedly. But I think you don't want to change your mind. You want your own definition again. Huh? In the TypeScript concept, I told you that constructor is used for instantiation. Am I right? Instantiation. So it is used for instantiation. Instantiation is creating object, right? We know that. Generally, constructor is responsible for instantiation. It is responsible for instantiation. That means it is responsible for creating a constructor object. Constructor object. So that means construct a component starts with instantiation. That means a constructor starts with creating of objects. It will start with creating of object. That means first creating of object is nothing but here creating a constructor. The first thing generally happens in every class is this constructor executes. So because it is a TypeScript class, so we have to know that it is responsible for instantiation. Okay. After that, what is the next phase that executes? So generally, just like constructor, even you don't write the constructor, so there will be a default constructor. We know that. So if you don't define a constructor, there will be by default constructor. Similarly, every component is having some events which you are not writing, but they are working in the background. If already a constructor is by default available, why we have to create our own constructor? Why we have to create an explicit constructor? If constructor is already is there, default constructor, why we have to create an explicit constructor? Then you can tell different points, like I am creating an explicit constructor for initializing the memory, for initializing of values. Am I right? Generally, you people say that I am writing an external constructor to initialize the values, to initialize the memory, to initialize the component related things and all. That's in a similar way, every component internally have several methods working. Even you don't write them, they are working. Then why to write them? You have to write them in order to configure some additional functionality. In order to configure the additional functionality, you have to write them. I will show you that. For first point, after the component is created, the first method that executes is ng on changes. This is the method that executes when after the constructor is created. Ng on changes is the first lifecycle hook. So constructor is not a lifecycle hook because lifecycle starts after creation. That means after the constructor, the creation of component, now the lifecycle starts. In the lifecycle, so first phase is on changes. NG on changes. This is the first life cycle method. Component starts with NG on changes. What happens in this method? So what happens in this NG on changes? So what happens in NG on changes? See, actually, in this phase, so many points are there. In this phase, what happens is, first, it will be responsible for initialize a value, initialize a value into property, initialize a value into property, assign a value into property, assign a value into property, then bind the property to DOM element. That means in the UI, bind the property to the DOM element. That means in the UI. Then identify, that means identify the change in value. Identify the change in value in UI. Identify the change in value in UI. And after that, next another option is update the new value. Update the new value. So that means it is responsible for handling all these interactions. So technically, it is responsible for so many things now. It is responsible for so many things. Initializing a value into property, assigning a value into property, binding the property to the DOM element, identifying the change in the DOM value, and update the new value. These all activities are performed on changes, NG on changes. Update the new value. Observe carefully these points, very important here, because questions in interviews will wire up based on these points only very regularly. Sometimes for experience level people, so your entire interview may happen on this topic only, on this life cycle hooks. So because so many questions are there here to ask, because remember, these kind of questions are very regular for experienced people, because for experienced people, so we need to test so they have good architectural knowledge or not. So for a ordinary fresher, having architectural knowledge is asking too much. So programming skills, logical skills are enough for freshers, actually, because architectural knowledge is at high level. If they have that knowledge, very good. But we don't expect so much architectural level knowledge from the beginners. But experienced people, we ask a lot of questions related to architecture to understand how much experience they have, and to understand do they know exactly where the activities are performed, because they need to be responsible for identifying the issues in the application, tracking the issues, identifying where the problem came, and fixing that. In that case, architecturally, they need to be very sound. So that's the reason these type of questions are very regular for experience level interviews. So here, see, suppose now in the class, so this is NG on changes. This is NG on changes. Actually, NG on changes, that means it is handling so many things. It is handling so many changes. So technically, we call all this mechanism as change detection. Change detection. change detection. That means technically any of these activities performed is considered to be change detection. Change detection. Now I will ask you some series of questions. You try to answer. So observe these points and try to answer them. For example, suppose I defined a class, so some home or also login component. In this we have so a property. So here we have a property, user name is any type. Now what do you say? Is change detected? What do you say? In login class, is change detected? Is change detection happening? Is change detection happening? Observe the points I given to you. Observe the points I given to you. Initialize a value to property. Are we initializing any value to property? Are we initializing any value to property? You are not initializing any value to property. And if I don't initialize, we are only declaring. Already I told you in variables concept. If you don't initialize, what will be the value? If you don't initialize, what will be the value? By default, what will be the value? Come on. So after learning so much concept, you cannot still be wrong. Huh? So the value, if it is not configured, you know that in JavaScript based environment anywhere, the value will be, by default, the value will be undefined. Am I right? Huh? The value by default will be undefined, not null. Okay, it is undefined. In JavaScript, everywhere the value is by default undefined. So now change is not detected. Suppose now I have defined equal to some John. Now what do you say? Is change detection true or false? Is change detection true or false? Change detection is true. That means change detection true because so some value is initialized into it. Initialized. If you don't initialize, suppose you access that, so simply configure that in this way. And later, anywhere you access that this dot username is equal to John, something like this. Now this is under change detection. This is under change detection. So declaring doesn't have any change detection. So change detection means initializing the value, assigning the value. Not only that, so you have, suppose here, this some value is there. Okay. Now we have some text box, or we have some text box. So input type is equal to text. And generally to the text box, so suppose I will give here. So we have the text box. So input type is equal to text. And to this text box, so I am using ng model. And we are defining username. So that means you are accessing the username. It is initialized. You are accessing the username and binding to this DOM element. This username is any type, and it is initialized with a value. And you are binding with, that means now this is change detection, and this is also change detection. That means binding that property to any DOM element is also change detection. That means if anybody asks you a question like, in which phase the values are binded to the DOM elements, in which phase the values are binded to DOM element. So in which phase values are binded into DOM element? So technically, how you have to answer that? In which phase values are binded to DOM element? What do you say? The correct technical answer is it is in change detection. It is in change detection. You have to say change detection. So, of course, change detection is managed by which event? Change detection is managed by which life cycle hook? Change detection is managed by which life cycle hook? It is managed by ng on changes. Ng on changes. Now, suppose I have written some event. Yes, good. Suppose I have written some event for this text box. That is key up. So is equal to, so here verify user. Now tell me, does it comes under change detection? 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 So it will come under change detection because observe this point, identify change in the value and update the new value. Who will identify and update? Who will identify and when it will identify and when it will update? Who will identify and update the value? Identify the change in the value. So change in the value is identified by using the event only, na? Am I right? The changes in the value are identified by whom? Already I told you, event notifies the changes. Remember that point? Technically, I explained that event notifies the changes. Event uses a delegate mechanism. Right? If you remembered the event definition I given to you, I told you that event technically, so event technically is a message sent by sender to its subscriber in order to notify the change. You remember that definition I given, right? I given the definition about event. Event is a message sent by sender. So to the subscriber, in order to notify the change. That is the definition I given you about the event. So that means this also comes under change detection. So now see, that's why I said that questions may be asked in several ways. Questions may be asked in several ways. If anybody asked you, so property binding comes under which phase? In Angular, property binding comes under which phase? Property binding comes under which phase? Good, change detection. Attribute binding comes under which phase? Attribute binding comes under which phase? Attribute binding also, so under change detection. Event binding comes under which phase? Event binding comes under which phase? Yeah. So that is also change detection. That means this is change detection is managed by which hook method? It is actually managed by ng on changes. ng on changes. And actually, ng on changes, how it will identify the changes? If anybody asks like how it identifies the changes, who is responsible for identifying the changes? In interviews, this question will come. I will upload a document related to all these points. In the classroom today, I will update that with all the questions and answers, you will have them. So here the point is, in ng on changes is the phase. In this phase, property binding, attribute binding, event binding, all these will work. But in ng on changes, who is responsible for identifying that change occurred or not? change occurred or not. That is managed by a class, by a object called simple changes. Simple changes object. Ng on changes depends on an object called simple changes. This simple changes object contains previous value and current value. Current value. It contains information about previous value and current value. That means as per the algorithm, change detection means previous value is not equal to current value. Previous value is not equal to current value. Then it is change detection. Understood? If previous value is equal to current value, if previous value is equal to current value, no change detected. And this is managed by simple changes. Simple changes object is responsible for identifying the previous value and current value. For example, I given now so many questions I told you, like now generally sometimes now what people ask, like, right, they will ask like, that means for example, so user name is any type empty and is equal to John. How it is change detected? Means how this is change detected. What is the previous value? What is the current value? What is previous value? What is current value in this case? In this case, what is the previous value and what is the current value? Very good. So very good. Undefined to John. Am I right? Undefined to John. Right. So that means change detected. It identifies that change. So sometimes the question will be so complicated that you may know the answer, but you may feel like, I never heard about that. You know the answer because whatever they have to ask under this context only, they cannot go outside. But the way of asking, the hierarchy of asking will be in a different approach. Due to that, you may little bit confused about the question asked, but actually you know the answer because nobody can go outside this context. So that means everyone have to ask under this context only, but in a different way. Due to that, so many times we will get a feeling like, I never heard this point, but actually that is also the concept. That's the reason so many consequences I am showing. Like people may ask us, so if value assigned, if value initialized, is property binding, attribute binding, event binding, all this comes under this category. This is change detection. And this is under the control of a hook. It is under the control of a hook called Ng on changes. Ng on changes is responsible for managing all this. It is responsible for managing all this. In the notes, I detailedly will give you all these points. So no need to worry about this diagram I'm drawing here. Just observe in the class, that's it. So that means what happens in this phase. So detailed points I will give you in the note. So this is change detection. Okay. After this change detection, then comes the next life cycle hook is after that. So we will have an Ng on init. This is nothing but this is the initialization phase. It is the initialization phase, which is called after Ng on changes. Means after Ng on changes, the first Ng on changes, this Ng on init will come. what is this on init is responsible to do? What init means what it will do? Ng on init is responsible for initialization of memory. It is responsible for initialization of memory. Already constructor is initializing. Constructor is initializing memory. Now, why you need this initialization again? Why you need this initialization again? Already constructor is initializing. But why we need this initialization here? Actually, this constructor is related to this class, this component, login component. Constructor is related to the login component. That is related to the login component. Constructor is related to the login component. We can create our own constructor also. We can create our own constructor also. It is related, even you create your own constructor, it is related to login component. Now, is it possible to access any another component in a component? What do you say? Is it possible to access a component in another component? Is it possible to access a component in another component? Already we done it, right? Already we learned it, right? Already we used it. That's what the previous concept was about, the parent child. Can we access a component in another component? Yes, we can access a component in another component. That's a simple, straightforward concept. Already we saw that. That's what we learned in the previous one. If a component is accessible in another component, that means here you see that. So that means you have the parent component, parent, and the constructor is for only parent. Inside this, you are having a child component. So this constructor is only for this child component. That is the reason you have seen that. It is only for this component. That is the reason you have seen what happened. So generally, whatever you declared in the child component is not accessible to parent. Whatever you declared in the parent, it is not accessible to child. Am I right? So even a component is accessed in another component. The parent component values are not accessible to child component. Child values are not accessible to parent component directly. That means now who is responsible? Who is responsible for transporting data from one component to another component? Who is responsible for transporting data from one component to another component? What we have discussed about that. Who is responsible for transporting data from one component to another component? Already we discussed that point. Transporting data from one component to another component, you need two important directives, input and output. Am I right? No. Input and output directives are required. These input and output directives are required with event emitters and all to transport the data from one component to another component. And to transport the data from one component to another component, these events are required. But there for both the components, so that there must be some memory initialized for both the components, so that these input and output activities are managed in that memory. Then it is available across the components. What do you say? Am I right? That means we need a common memory for both the components. Understood the point? We need a common memory for both the components. And who is responsible for initializing this memory? Who is responsible for initializing this memory? Who is responsible for initializing the memory? So who is responsible for initializing this memory, common memory? That is done by ng on init. Now, if anyone asks what is difference between constructor and ng on init, what do you will say? What is difference between constructor and ng on init? What do you will say? Constructor initializes for specific component only. Am I right? Private for every component. Private for every component. Constructor is private for every component. And ng on init, it makes the information memory available across the components. That means transporting the data from one component and to another component. To transport data from one component to another component, we need a common memory for those components. That common memory is initialized by whom? The common memory is initialized by using ng on init. Ng on it is responsible for doing that. I hope you people are clear, understood these 2 points. Am I clear? Right? So 2 points, on changes, ng on changes, and ng on init. Ng on init. These are 2 important points. Okay. Remember, ng on init is only allocating the memory. Is only allocating the memory. That's it. But the transporting activity, that means if the event need to be value need to be transported across, that means you need a custom event. That means input output requires a custom event. That means they need an event emitter. So this event emitter uses the help of output and emits the value outside this. So these are called custom events. So the custom events, these are custom events. And these are managed. These are managed by using a life cycle hook, ng do check. Ng do check is responsible for configuring input and output activities. It is responsible for configuring the event emitter, and configuring the custom events. It is responsible for configuring the custom events. That means in which phase the values are emitted outside the current component. In which phase the values are emitted outside the current component. In which phase the values are emitted outside the current component, right? That is ng on do check. ng on do check. In which phase the values come from another component to current component. In which phase the values come from another component to the current component. That means input. That is also done by using ng do check. ng do check. So now if in interviews, anybody given you like this, so that means we have a button click is equal to some insert. So some functionality is there. And we have app filter. So suppose I said filter change. So filter change. So like this. So some method is defined here. Now, can you tell me these 2 phases? Button click belongs to which phase and filter change belongs to which phase? Button click belongs to which phase? Button click belongs to which phase? And filter change belongs to which phase? Both are events only. Both are events only, na? What do you say? Both are events only, na? Right? Both are events only. Both are events only. But which one is custom event and which one is default event? Default event is click. Custom event is filter change. Then click happens on which phase? Click happens on which phase? So happens on ng on changes. Good. Filter change happens on ng do check. Ng do check. That is the reason sometimes in interviews they ask a question like, if a event is not able to send the notification, if an event is not able to send the notification outside component, event is not able to send notification outside the component, then what you will do? If an event is not capable of send a notification outside the component, because event can notify only inside the component. If a notification have to be sent outside the component, so then who is going to notify outside the component? Who is going to notify outside the component? Outside the component. Who is going to notify outside the component? So actually, who is going to notify outside the component? You should say custom event. Understood? Custom event. And custom events are managed by which phase? Custom events are managed by which hook method? So it is managed by ng do check. Ng do check. So I hope you are clear. Are you clear with these 3 points? ng on changes, ng on init, ng do check. Is it clear to everyone? Right? So yeah, good. Right. Now next step is after the configuration. Now very important here is another point is generally, so when you are binding the data, when you are configuring the data, when you are binding and configuring the data. So technically, when you are binding and configuring the data. So one important point here is the data binding. So I already told you that, for example, so we have a container to HTML element. We are binding the content. To HTML element, we are binding any content. So suppose we have image. So src is equal to, suppose I defined image src is equal to some photo path. Photo path I given from a specific property name. Now this comes under which phase? This comes under which phase? Image is assigned with a source that comes from a path. This comes under which phase? This comes under ng on changes. Am I right? Yes, good. This comes under ng on changes. Now, sometimes you have seen in general Angular, you have seen that we used a dynamic container. We used a dynamic container like ng container. To that we can bind some properties. Ng, if you can bind some properties, you can write ng for ng if for switches and all. We have seen that. Now very important is, so what is the role of this container? So ng container, what is the role of this container? This container role is dynamically render HTML. Its role is dynamically render HTML. Its role is dynamically rendering the HTML. dynamically rendering the HTML. That means adding elements, removing HTML elements that ng container will do. Not only ng container, adding and removing the elements, into HTML is managed by these all directives like ng if for HTML element or anywhere. So, or we use ng for, this is for iterating and displaying the contents. We have like ng switch, which is performing the iterations and defining them. That means these are nothing but they are deciding what to render, how to render content in HTML. That means the content that is to be rendered into the HTML, it is decided by these directives. Which one to add, which one to remove, whether to add one, whether to add multiple in the DOM. In the HTML, what to render is defined by using these by default. So this is actually managed. That means selecting what to render, specifying what to render inside HTML, what to load into HTML is defined by using the event ng after content init. After content init. ng after content init will actually fire up in two ways. That means it will fire up. So when on init happened, it will fire up when on changes happened. It will fire up when do check happened. That means on custom events or normal events, after normal events and after custom events, this ng after content init will come. That means what is the place of ng content init? What is the location of ng content init? The location of ng content init is not after do check actually. Actually, it will do so here. It will come this phase. This phase will come two times. After the general events, this phase will come because it has to render the HTML. And after do check also, this phase will come. After ng on changes, that means after general events, the output should be rendered. After custom events also output should be rendered. The output which need to be default rendered according to your actions, that is managed by using ng after content init. So ng after content init fires up after on changes and do check. That means after general events, it will display in HTML. After general events, it will display in HTML. After this custom events also, the output will be rendered in HTML. That means the process of generating output and presenting, rendering in HTML is managed by using ng after content init. ng after content init is used to do that. Now, default which one to display, this will decide. Default which one to display, this will decide. Actually, that is managed by using ng if will do that, ng switch will do that, ng switch will do that, and we have like ng for will do that. So which one to display, how to display, everything is decided by these options. ng after content init is going to do this. Now, very important, if you remembered, we discussed a concept like if if anything is not inbuilt defined, if anything is not inbuilt, that means we can render the content. We can render the content explicitly also. You can render the content explicitly also. We can render the content explicitly. Rendering the content explicitly means what we can do is we can create a template. or bring a component. We can create a template and bring a component and render explicitly into another component. That means the process of, observe carefully here, this process, that means we have app parent. In this app parent, now whatever is being displayed, a div is displayed by using if conditions. This is all managed by ng after content init. But is anything possible that I can bring some external content and display inside it? Is there any possibility that I can bring some external content and render inside it? Can I bring anything externally and render inside it? What do you say? Can I bring externally any content and render inside it? Can I bring any content from externally and render inside this? We can do that. That means we can add app child into it. That means now what happens is it will bring the child component related HTML and render into this HTML, existing HTML. If now what is difference between div and app child? Div is a DOM element which belongs to the parent, but a child is rendering an element that comes from external. If any HTML have to come from external source and render into your component, then that is managed by a specific event, and that is ng after. We call this as ng after content checked. Content init, content checked. Content init decides what to render inside your component according to the condition. Content checked indicates what content to be rendered from external source. That means if a child component have to come and render into the parent component, that means you are bringing HTML from external component and rendering into this component, from external component and rendering into the component. So this process of rendering external HTML into existing HTML is actually called as content projection. We have change detection and content projection. Two important points are there. Content projection doesn't means that in a component what it is presenting. In a component, if any content is coming from external source and it is presented, then we call as content projection. And in which phase content projection is managed? In which phase content projection is managed? The content projection is managed ng after content checked. So rendering the content of current component is managed by whom? Rendering the content of current component is managed by after content init. Bringing the component from external source and rendering is managed by ng after content init. And that comes under the category of, we technically call this as content projection. Change detection and content projection. These two are the important points. This is another key concept you need to understand. So what is content init? What is content checked? Is it clear to everyone? Yes, good. After deciding remember, this is only decision making. That means which content to render, which content to render inside the component, which content to render bringing from outside the component is decided by these two. Is decided by two. It is decided by these two. Actually, that is decided by using these two. Now, after this, what will happen is, that means this will decide which one to render in the current component, but rendering work is not done here. Rendering work is not done by this phase. Which phase will do the rendering work? The rendering work will be done by using ng after view init. View init. This will finally render. Finally render. Which one to render is decided by content init, and rendering is done by after view init. After view init. Similarly, which one to render from external? Which one to render from external is decided by ng after content init, and rendering that is done by ng after view checked. After view checked. Understood the point? Is it clear to you? That means which one to render is decided by content init. Which one to render, that is decided by content init. Rendering is done by view init. Understood? Rendering means generating output. Init and view checked. What is difference between view init and view checked? What is difference between view init and view checked? The difference between view init and contents of view init will render the contents of current component. Understood? View init will render the contents of current component. Understood? And view checked will render the content of external components. Yeah, child components, external components. Yeah. And finally, after this, then comes the phase. That means after rendering, now once you go from this component to another component, you are changing from login to register, then finally comes the phase ng on destroy. In this phase, so it is going to delete all the memory allocated and clean up and load another component into memory. So it will delete all the memory and load another component into the memory. So that means it performs automatically cleanup. Once you finish using this component, you move from this component to another component, then automatically it is going to get and display another component, allocate another component lifecycle. Now this component related memory, whatever allocated, it is destroyed. This is basically the concept how it works. That means how it is going to manage all the phases internally. Am I clear? Is it clear? These all phases are internally working. For every component. And this is the area where you need to be very perfect in your interviews, because as an Angular developer, so if you are attending an interview, so and you are not aware of this concept, then 30-40% of your interview you cannot handle, because so questions majority will be related to this. You need to be very perfect in this. So that is the component lifecycle. So now we will use these hooks in various next level stages now. That means while accessing data from, that means now as a developer, you will understand when to use these events according to situation. Already you know those phases. Then depending on various situations, we will understand all the concepts. So that means we will make use of these events now in some examples and we will try them so that you can understand situation. Why? Because as a developer, we should know that you don't need to write these events. Internally, they are working, but we generally write these events if you want some extra work to be done in that phase. Already in that phase, some work is going on. If you want some extra work to happen, then you have to write them. You have to configure them. That's what we need to do. For example, already memory is initialized. So for the component, suppose I want to keep the memory in such a way that that memory should be available to the next component coming, child component coming. Then which phase we have to use? Then which event we have to write? Which method we have to write? If I want the memory to be available to the next child component coming, so then where I have to configure which phase we have to use. I hope you remember that now, right? We have to use ng on init, right? Yeah, good. On this ng on init, it is responsible for managing the functionalities, right? Now we will use this in various phases and we will see how to work with them in various phases. Okay. So that we will see in the next levels, in the next examples, we will see them, how to work with them and in various situations, right? Now, I hope you are clear with all this topic. Now, in the next session, today this is enough. And in the next session, tomorrow, we will discuss about the concept of pipes and services. While working with these pipes and services, you will come across all these events now, how we can write the hooks and work with them in different situations. So next we will go discuss about what are pipes, what are services, how to use them in Angular. That we will see in our next session. Tomorrow we will do that. Okay. Right. Tomorrow we'll continue with this. All these notes, whatever I explained, I will upload into the classroom. Right.